Okay, we are live streaming on YouTube and recording. So I am going to, we don't have a quorum. So for anybody who's watching, we're just going to proceed as just a meeting. If we let people in and get a quorum, then we won't move to adopt anything.
Joel should be, I'm sorry, Sharon, Joel should be getting in any second now.
Yeah, I have 8. You have 8? Yeah, we need 11. So,
yeah, okay.
All right, so Eric, do you want me to just, let me see if I can make you the host. Will that be disruptive though, if people are trying to get in?
No, I can just let them in. Usually
Okay.
it usually just pops up and you say admit, I think.
Yeah, okay, hold on. Let me see if I can make, oh, I can make you a co-host. I'm just nervous, everybody. I've been having some computer issues. So I was gonna say, I'm just gonna make you the host and you can let them in.
Sure.
Okay, let's see if you want to change. Yes. Okay, so you're now the host.
Got it.
So thank you everybody for taking your time. And I guess it's 4:08 and we're going to proceed just with the meeting. If we get a quorum, as I indicated, we'll go back to the minutes at the end. And so I guess we'll just jump right into it. Francisco, if you want to just introduce Eric and his team, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I will happily do that. And let me reintroduce myself. I think it's the first time everyone's seen me without my COVID beard, which I just shed over the weekend, and I'm still trying to get used to it myself. It's been a year, and depending on your perspective, either COVID's kind of over and things are opening up, or it's going to be with us forever, in which case I didn't want to be with that beard forever. So if you didn't recognize me, it's still me. But more importantly, today we have our sub-consultant RKG with us. And RKG is going to give us an overview of the work that they've done going into a housing assessment. And some of the material I think will be familiar to you because it involves some demographic work that we've already presented to you. But it's all part of understanding what your housing needs are as a community. And Eric, are you sharing your screen?
I can. I just was
yeah, please.
For you.
Let's go ahead because it has our agenda, and we'll just jump right into things. All right, so here we are, our 7th meeting. And if we go to the next slide, a very quick overview of our agenda. And we always make some minor adjustments to these between the time they get sent out to you and by the time we get to our presentation. But it's pretty much the same, just a little reorganized. So I'll hand it over to Eric in a moment to talk a little bit more about his team and the work that they do and will be doing on this project. And they have a pretty thorough presentation for you. Then we're going to come back to our draft neighborhood map that Sharon and I have had some back and forth on, and we've had other contributors as well. Perry shared some mapping and thoughts with us. And then once again, revisit our stakeholder list. Sharon's and Jennifer have been growing that list and talk about that. And then and close it out with an overview of where we're at and what the next steps are. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, I think, for the first time in front of all of you to present some of the work that we've been doing. Just by way of introduction, I'm Eric Halverson, Vice President and Principal with RKG Associates, and joining me is Summer Pan. She's been working closely with me, presenting and pulling together much of what you'll see today. RKG Associates, we've been around about 40 years, founded and based in New England. I manage the Boston, Massachusetts office, so we're happy to be taking part of the project here with you all, presenting today the housing, and I think at a future meeting, the economic development pieces of the POCD. So without further ado, today we hope to go over kind of the demographics and the housing market conditions, and that'll generally touch on a couple of different things. As Francisco mentioned, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the demographics, households and employment, because I think you've seen some of that, but I did want to just share that back with you again quickly because demographics and household change is really what drives housing supply and housing demand. So it is very integrally related to the housing section and chapter of the POCD. We'll spend most of our time talking about the housing stock, so the units, housing tenure, vacancy, values, rents, and cost burdening. And we'll finish up with looking at housing projections as well as gaps in housing affordability. So first, we'll start just with some quick demographic context. As I mentioned, as population household changes, that really has a key impact on housing today and housing into the future. So just looking back, Danbury's population grew by about 13% over the last 9 years. And it's projected, according to the projections that are formulated from the Connecticut State Data Center, to grow by another 6% or so through the year 2030. It's just shy of about 5,000 residents over that 10-year period. But that growth, though, it hasn't necessarily been consistent when we look at it across age cohorts. Most of Danbury's recent growth, much like that of Fairfield County, has been in residents within the age bracket of sort of 18 to 24. So your younger students, maybe your college students and your young professionals, and also older residents, those over the age of 55. In fact, Danbury actually outpaced the county in both categories of ages over the last 10 years. In terms of households, so non-family households, which are either single person households, so one person living by themselves in a unit, or two or more unrelated individuals living together, are actually growing faster than family households, which are family households are defined by the census as two or more related individuals, either by blood or marriage, living together in a housing unit. So increases were amongst those living alone. So we saw spikes in those living alone over the last 10 years. And that sort of covered both younger householders living alone as well as older householders living alone. And then interestingly, Danbury saw a pretty significant increase in single parent households, particularly those that were headed by a female. And then single parent households in Danbury actually comprise about 18% of all households, which we thought was really interesting. So as we're thinking later on in the process about strategies, goals, and recommendations, I think these are sort of things to be aware of and keep in mind when we're thinking about housing needs in the future. I meant to mention too, that growth in households also did not necessarily occur as rapidly as growth in total population. So population grew faster than the sort of percentage of households over the last 10 years, which actually was the result of increasing household sizes, primarily driven by increases in households with 5 or more people. And that was fairly consistent across both renter household growth and owner household growth. Danbury also saw pretty sharp increases in household income, driven mostly by households earning over $100,000 a year, as you can see here in the graph on the right. This followed a very similar pattern to Fairfield County. And really, we like to look at household income because it, of course, has a direct implication for what households can afford to pay or conversely are willing to pay for housing. But while growth in that household income was fairly universal across most categories of race as well as ethnicity, it wasn't necessarily equitable. Hispanic and Latino households have some of the lowest incomes in the city, generally about $15,000 to $20,000 lower than most other households across racial and ethnic categories. In Danbury, people of color tend to be concentrated in and around the downtown, which is actually from, I think, Francisco's research and our research so far, is really where we see a lot of overlapping issues related to housing occur. And I'll keep pointing that out sort of as we go through the data points tonight in the presentation. When we look at income by housing tenure, so renter households and owner households, we see some pretty significant shifts as well. So renters are seeing significant upticks in income, as you can see on the graph on the left, especially households that are earning at or above $100,000 a year. That income cohort, it grew about 98% or 800 more households over the last 9 years. It's worth noting that renter households earning less than $25,000 a year, so on the other end of the income spectrum, also grew, like very little, about like that 1.1% that you see there on the left, but it did grow. I can tell you in many places that we work, usually that is coming downwards, similar to what you see on the owner household side of things. So it was interesting to see that actually ticked up, even though it was only 1%. Again, so when we look at those incomes across the city, median incomes tend to be lowest in the downtown area, shown on the map on the right. So we're correlating again with higher concentrations of people of color in this case. So shifting for just a second to employment, and I tried to trim this down. We have, in the report, we'll have a lot more slides on employment, both by industry sector and occupation, but we just wanted to share with you for a second. We looked at projected employment by occupation in the city of Danbury out to the year 2030, just to get a sense of the types of jobs and the average earnings by job, sort of in the top 5 largest growth categories, which we've sort of trimmed it to in the graph on the right, just to understand the earnings that people may have and how that might translate into housing costs if they choose to live and work in the city of Danbury. So you can see from the chart on the right that healthcare jobs kind of lead the way with over 1,000 new jobs, yet the average earnings are relatively low. This is also true for food preparation, maintenance jobs, and education within those 5 categories. So really what this says to us is that sort of the workforce housing and the affordability will, I think, be key to attracting and maintaining a strong and stable workforce in Danbury, something that we're going to explore as we work through the economic development pieces of the POCD as well. So to accommodate the growing number of people and households, Danbury saw an increase in housing units, growing by about 3% since 2010. Growth was split primarily between structures that have 20 or more units in them and also duplexes. So those 2 categories made up the vast majority, if not almost all, of the growth that Danbury saw in its housing unit mix. Single-family homes continue to make up the largest share of Danbury's housing stock at about 54% of all units. So when we do our housing work, we really like to look at information both quantitatively, but also sort of geographically to get a sense of the geographic distribution of residential types. So where are different types of housing across the particular community, in this case, Danbury. So the map on the right shows different types of housing, ranging from single family units to apartments to mobile homes, and also the location of those parcels across the city and how they're being used for residential uses. So you can see that the more intensely developed areas with housing tend to be along that I-84 corridor and also in the downtown area. We also like to get a sense of how much residential land is being utilized by different housing types. So the chart on the left gives you some examples. So it shows single family units comprise about 82% of Danbury's residential land. So anything that's being used for residential uses, single family is about 82% of that land. Apartments and condos, for example, are about 10.5%. So it just gives you a sense of the amount of land that's being used by different residential types. Usually what we see is the more intense the development, so condos or apartments tend to use up less land. Single families or maybe 2 families that require larger lot sizes tend to use up more land. So as we think about the condition of housing, we like to look at the year that the unit was built or the structure was built, and also map it to see where older versus newer housing exists in the city. Housing units are actually pretty well dispersed in Danbury by year built, as shown here on the chart on the left, with nearly about 40% of all units constructed after 1980. Honestly, by New England standards, it's actually pretty good. But again, you'll see the blue coloring on the map. Mostly that indicates units that were constructed before 1930. Those are mostly concentrated again in that downtown area, again, overlapping with lower incomes, higher concentration of rental housing, and some of the most intensely developed areas of the city. And you can see kind of as you go, we sort of radiate outward from the downtown, the housing, the colors of the map start to change from yellow to orange to red, indicating newer and newer housing sort of as you move outwards, kind of the fingers coming out of downtown. So now we're just going to shift again to look a little more deeply at owner and renter households and units. So just as an overview, today about 58% of all occupied housing units in the city are owner occupied and about 42% are renter occupied. Over the last 10 years, Danbury has seen its renter occupied households grow by about 14%. This is a trend that we're seeing in many parts of the country, so it's not necessarily something that's unique to Danbury, with demographic and income shifts really creating a strong demand for rental housing. As we mentioned earlier, much of the household growth for both renters and owners are in those 5+ person households, which is shown here on the graph on the right. You can see there's a lot of growth across most of the household types in renters, some declines in owners, but that 5+ person household for both owner and renter households has grown quite a bit over that 9-year period. So in addition to occupied units, we also look at vacant units. Danbury's percent of vacant units, their total percentage of vacant units, has increased slightly over the last 9 years. But if we look at the categories of vacant units, so we like to break down vacancy into different types of vacant units. So you have vacant available. So those are the vacant units that are actively being marketed, whether it's a rental or it's an owner occupied unit. So those are the vacant units that are either for sale or they're for rent or they're actively being rented or actively being sold. That's the number that we look at to sort of determine what we call the healthiness of the housing market. So Danbury's vacant available percentage is about 2.5%. We typically consider a healthy vacancy rate to be somewhere in the 3 to 5% range. So Danbury actually has less vacancy than what we would consider to be healthy. So it seems to be a fairly tight market right now, both on the owner and the renter side. And interestingly, the number of vacant other units. So if you look to the right-hand side of the screen in that category, vacant other, that's increased. It's almost doubled in about 10 years. And those units are really interesting. The census combines about 13 different categories of vacant units into what they call vacant other. And that includes units that are uninhabitable for a variety of reasons, units that might either have gone through the foreclosure process or be in foreclosure. It could have title disputes between family members, who owns it, who's getting it when someone passes away. Units that are under major renovation, rendering them unlivable. So there's about, like I said, about 13 different categories that they combine in there. But this category is usually a good indicator for portions of the housing stock that might need rehabilitation or some kind of intervention to get them back into productive use and get them back into the rental market or back into the owner market. So now we'll just spend a few minutes looking at the owner-occupied housing stock. In Danbury, most of the owner-occupied stock can be found in single-family detached or attached housing. Very typical in almost every community to see a very high percentage of your ownership stock in one unit buildings or structures. The rest of the units are spaced pretty evenly across all the other categories, as you can see on the right, with about 5% of units in buildings with 10 or more units. About 68% of the owner stock is less than 60 years old, which again, I think by New England standards is actually pretty good. A lot of times we see a pretty high percentage sort of built before 1960, usually maybe 40, 50, plus maybe 60% in some communities that haven't seen a lot of housing investment over the years. So Danbury seems to be doing pretty good. Interestingly, the median home value as reported by the census in Danbury, so that's the median value of the entire owner-occupied housing stock across the city, has actually declined over the last 10 years by about 12%, which is kind of interesting. Most of the city's housing stock is valued at or above about $250,000, but homes valued in that range also declined by about 19%. We think that this could be the result of sort of valuation adjustments coming out of the Great Recession. Maybe Danbury was just a little bit slower to recover than other communities, so those median values haven't necessarily come up. We might see some of those changes with the new 2020 census that as they start to release that data more and more over the next couple of months. One other thing in terms of value, which looks at all the owner-occupied units across the city, we also like to look at sales. So the units that are actually selling. So we use data from Redfin and we look back from 2016 to I think March of 2021, trying to capture some of the pandemic sales. And it was kind of interesting. The sale price between 2016 and 2021 has actually come up about 11% over that 5-year period. And that really contrasts with that drop in median home value that we see. So what that tends to indicate to us is units that are actively on the market and selling, the prices are going up. Things that are sort of sitting might not be changing hands. Maybe they're older units that have been owned by someone for a long time. Maybe they're not being kept up. Those are the units I think that we should take a look at and maybe think about recommendations for going forward. But the things that are selling tend to be coming upward, at least over the last 5 years. Here you can just see the numbers broken out by the sales, and so sales by dollar value. Again, this is the data from Redfin over the last 5 years. Note the sharp increase in sales for homes listed at or above 300,000, those homes that have sold. That's the orange line that's sort of spiking to the top, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years. Most other categories kind of remained flat. They didn't necessarily go up or down. They had a couple of variations here and there. But compared to what we see with the housing stock that's selling at or above 300,000, it's quite different. Most newer homes in Danbury are selling for about $100,000 more than older homes built before 1960. So people are looking for those new homes. Also, they're looking for larger homes. Homes with 3 or more bedrooms comprised about 70% of all sales over this period of time. So moving over to the rental housing stock, we see a much more dispersed housing stock by unit type and building size than we did with owner occupied, as you see in the graph on the right. Within the rental stock, only about 20% of all units are in that single family structure, that 1 unit structure, compared to what we saw with the owner side was about 81%. Interestingly, about 60% of all rental housing in Danbury is in structures with 1 to 4 units, many in duplexes, triple deckers, fourplexes. That's kind of interesting and unique. A lot of times we expect to see most of the rental housing kind of in 10 unit buildings or more. But in Danbury, it's actually pretty well dispersed, which I thought was really an interesting point. The median gross rent in Danbury has increased by about 23% over the last 10 years to where it is now just under $1,500 a month. The largest increases in rent were seen in units renting at $1,500 or more per month. Rents for units that are priced over $2,000 a month increased about 155%, or an additional 1,160 units over that time period. These increases obviously have direct implications for housing affordability on the rental side and leading to some pretty severe instances of cost burdening in the city, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The graph on the right shows how rents have changed over the last 5 years by unit type. So studios, 1 bed, 2 bed, 3 bed, 4+ bedrooms. You can see how much, it's kind of interesting how much the 4-bedroom units have increased. They're up about 44% over that 5-year period, correlating, I think, with the increases in the larger rental households that we talked about earlier. And sort of conversely, rents on the studios, so the smallest units, are also up about 53% over that period of time. So I know when we talk about some questions at the end, one thing that Summer and I have been wondering is sort of what is the impact of the student market, especially on the 4+ bedroom units, and is that sort of helping to drive up those rents that we've seen over this 5-year period. We also note just quickly on the rental side that a lot of those renter households, again, are mostly concentrated in that downtown area along the I-84 corridor as well. Again, the area where there's the older units, lower incomes, and higher concentrations of housing intensity. So lastly on this part, we wanted to show you some data on cost burdening. So if you're not familiar with the term cost burdening, it's a term that's used by HUD to classify households, both renter and owner, that are spending more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. So in Danbury, about 55% of all renter households are considered to be cost burdened. So they're spending more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And about 25% are considered severely cost burdened, or those that might be 10% of their income on housing costs. This compares to only 33% of owner households that are cost burdened, and only 13% of owner households are considered to be severely cost burdened. 50% cost burdening for renter households is pretty high. That's higher than we typically see. 25% severe cost burden is also pretty high, definitely higher than we typically see. So it seems like the lower incomes on the rental housing side, the increases in rental costs over time are really sort of all combining to create a situation where we have 55% of our renter households spending more than what they probably should or could afford to spend on housing costs. So as part of our analysis, we wanted to try to quantify housing needs today and also looking forward to the year 2030 and to the future. So we'll start by just quickly looking at housing affordability today in Danbury. About 51% of all renter households and about 25% of all owner households earn less than 50% of the area median income, or less than $50,000 a year if we translate that into a dollar value. This totals to just over 10,700 households across the city, both owner and renter. There are about 30% more renter households that are at or below that 50% of area median income range than there are owners, sorry, which is attributing, I think, again, to that continued cost burdening, struggles with affordability for those renter households. We also wanted to look at the number as well as the location of Danbury's current deed restricted affordable units, or those units which are restricted to households at or below a certain income threshold, usually measured by the percent of area median income. The city currently has 12% of its year-round housing stock as deed restricted affordable, according to Connecticut's Department of Housing. We got the data directly from the Department of Housing for this. This exceeds the state's mandated 10% threshold, which is good for Danbury, as many communities across Connecticut have failed to reach or even maintain that percentage. Again, similar to what we saw throughout the presentation, the vast majority of those units, as indicated by the dots on the map, are concentrated again in that sort of downtown I-84 corridor area. And very little deed restricted affordable housing has really been built anywhere else in Danbury. As you can see, sort of outside, there's a couple of dots around, but really the biggest concentration is kind of in this central part. So the next two slides compare owner and renter unit supply. So how many units do we have versus the demand by income? So the way that we do this is we look at household income for all the owner households in Danbury and the renter households in Danbury, and we compare those households to units that might be affordable to those households in Danbury, if that makes sense. So on the owner side, what we see here is on the far left, we have households that are at or below 30% of the area median income. And we have the units that are technically affordable to those households at that price point. And we sort of go up the income bands, 30 to 50% of AMI, 50 to 80, 80 to 100, and so on. And we calculate basically how many households there are compared to how many units there are at that price point. We subtract the two, and we're either left with a surplus or a deficit. And what we normally see is what you see on the screen in most markets, especially here in New England. There's often a deficit on the owner side for the extremely low income households, those who are under 30%, mostly because it's hard to produce those units, especially ownership units that are affordable to those households at that low of an income. Also, those households have a very hard time getting into the ownership market. They have to compete with other buyers who might be bringing more money to the table. They might not income qualify. They might not have great credit scores or really any good credit history, and they struggle to save up enough down payment to enter the homeownership market. So we most often see those households typically as renters. But it's interesting in Danbury, there's a surplus sort of in the middle of the market, kind of that triangle that you see there between sort of 50 and 100% of AMI, and then it drops off again. Which means that the households at the lowest end of the spectrum and the highest end of the spectrum, there's not necessarily housing available to them based on what they could technically afford to pay, which means that there could be a dearth of housing sort of at the price points that would satisfy the 100+ AMI market. And what's happening is they all come together in the middle, and they sort of squeeze the middle, and they create price competition in the middle. So if you're saying a household at 80% of AMI, you're kind of in this band here. You're earning a certain income. You may be able to save up a certain amount of down payment. You might not be able to bring as much cash to closing. Your financing might not look as good as someone who's, say, above 120% of AMI and competing for that same unit. So when we see the squeeze in the middle, you've got these households at the top end sort of buying down into the middle of the market and creating a lot of price competition. Now, if we look at the renter side of the equation, we see something a little bit similar. You kind of see the same triangular shape in the middle of the market. But if you look at the deficit for renter households under 30% of AMI, that number was about 665 on the owner. Now it's ballooned to about 2,400, meaning there's a pretty severe deficit of affordable rental units to those households who are under 30% of AMI. Now, I will say those tend to be the most difficult units to produce, not only on the owner side, but the renter side. They need to be heavily subsidized. They're most often the rental units that are provided by, say, like a housing authority, for example, or nonprofits. And there's just not really enough money and enough subsidy to go around to usually satisfy the demand. This is very typical of what we see in many markets. The same on the upper end. You can see, again, there's sort of a deficit in the rental market for the upper end. If you remember back from the household income slides, I had mentioned that renter households, some of the highest percentage growth that was seen over the last 9 years was for those households earning at or above $100,000 a year. That's your 100%, 120% and above of AMI that you see over here. So again, what happens is you've got folks on the 30% end who are having to rent up in the market, more expensive units than what they should probably be renting. And you have folks who are on the upper end of the market renting down, again, sort of squeezing the middle of that market and creating price competition in the middle. So the last piece that we have is just on estimating future growth. So as I mentioned before, Danbury's projected to add just under 5,000 new residents over the next 10 years. So RKG, we use those projections and we ran them through our housing demand model, which estimates future demand for both owner and renter housing, as well as demand for new housing units. So we believe, based on the projections in our housing model, there could be demand in the future for somewhere upwards of 750, 755 housing units above and beyond what exists today. And that breaks down into about 330 ownership units and about 424 renter units. So then we also just broke it down in the last two slides, future demand by household size. So what we do is we extrapolate and say, well, if percentages of households by household size remain as they are today in 2021, we project about 57% of new household demand will come from 1- and 2-person households, mostly on the younger and the older end of the age spectrum. And then obviously we can't forget about the 25% of households that could come from 4+ person households, sort of in line with the changes that we've seen over the last 10 years with that big growth in 5+ person households. And the final slide just looks at future housing by income level, again, using the same income splits as we have in the city today, projecting those out. About half of new households would have incomes at or below 80% of AMI. For renters, that figure jumps to about 66%. Given the lower incomes that we see in Danbury for renter households. Okay, so I know I threw a ton of information. I think we can make this available too by PDF, Francisco, if folks want to take a
yeah, we usually follow up with the PDF. So with that being said, we don't want this to be just a presentation. We do want this to be a conversation and a dialogue, and we'd love to have some feedback from those attending. Based upon what we just presented and what Eric reviewed in terms of what the numbers tell us, you tell us what type of housing do you feel that Danbury needs? Not everyone at once. or if you're talking, turn off your mute button.
Yeah, so Sharon, so I just found it interesting about the family size, the unit, 5 to 4+, and the number of units in that category, and everybody chime in. I mean, I think part of you see that as a big number because we have older housing that used to be a single family, now broken up into, 4 units in it. I mean, they were big, huge homes. Right. Some of them in downtown that have, a lot of units with a lot of bedrooms in it. And so I think that's interesting. And I think that we need to look at, well, I wanted to ask Eric a question about, so the people, the higher end that are renting down, like what's the incentive to have them, stop the squeeze, I guess. Everybody's looking to, well, not everybody's looking to rent for the amount that they can afford. They want to get a better deal. So they'll continue the squeeze. So what could we do to incentivize that that segment? Because that will relieve the pressure, some of the pressure, I think, based on what you said.
Yeah, it could. And so some of that would be, maybe marketing to certain developers and saying, hey, this segment of our population exists and they potentially could afford a little bit more than what might be in the market today. So one thing could be, encouraging new multifamily rental housing development, like highly amenitized buildings, where they could actually get a little bit of a rent premium. The other thing I would say is it could just be additional housing production in general, even if it is sort of at the same price point, that just adds more housing, which just provides more opportunities, even though those folks at the top of the market, those households might still have to sort of quote unquote buy down. If you're adding housing stock, it's you're sort of relieving some of the pressure that way as well. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that if they could afford, say, $2,500 a month, that's what we should build. Because if the market is like $1,900 a month and that's where developers are going to feel comfortable, putting the units, that's probably what they're going to do. So I would say it's sort of a combination of maybe encouraging, kind of higher end building typologies and having those conversations with developers active in the market, as well as just increasing the overall number of rental units in the city.
And how does that translate to helping the supply on the other side of things, right? On the lower end spectrum.
Yep. So there's a process that's been studied. It's called filtering. And essentially how the theory goes is if you're adding units, particularly units maybe a little bit at the top of the market, the units that are maybe priced more to your 50 to 80% of AMI, those folks can sort of move up through the market, and it frees up units that then, if they're vacant, there's the potential that those prices might come down a little bit. If they're older units and you're introducing newer housing into the market, there's more competition. People want to go into the newer stuff if they can afford it. So the prices of those existing units start to come down a little bit, and it essentially opens up slightly less expensive housing for people who are at the lower incomes to kind of filter into those units, if that makes sense. So a lot of it is about just adding housing stock, particularly newer housing stock, or modernizing existing housing stock that could then be offered at a slightly higher price point. And it allows households to kind of filter through the housing market that way.
And how does it, and I don't mean to take up all the, I just have a whole bunch of questions. What about the in-migration of people, right? So we have a community, we have certain needs, and in order for the people who are living here to kind of move up into the system, it's kind of, those units are then being taken by people who are coming in with higher incomes. So you're not really affecting the balance, I don't think.
Yep, I agree. So I know we haven't gotten to this point yet with the project, of course, but when we look at strategies and we look at the goals and the strategies, some things that I would think about would be, are there ways in which we could look at trying to increase the number or the percentage of deed restricted affordable units? And then one thing that I've seen work well here in Massachusetts is having like local preference for those units. I know there's some restrictions, like I don't think you can do 100% local preference, but maybe you can do 50%, 60%, 70%, so that some high percentage of those units that are deed restricted are sort of being set aside for existing residents of Danbury who were already here prior to those being built, can enter the lottery system that way and have access to those units, versus having to go out into, as you were saying, Sharon, sort of go out into the market and compete for unrestricted units. So I think it's kind of a balance between letting the market do its own thing, but then what are the interventions that the city can put in place to try to address housing needs that probably won't be addressed through the market rate development or through sort of this filtering process that obviously takes time to do.
Right. So it's because, I mean, we have zones that allow housing and incentive option. So, you get to build more units if a portion of them are deed restricted as affordable. And that has helped our inventory, but we don't get a lot of those. And we only pick up a couple of units each time, we get a development. So it's not a big influx. For instance, and I know other people don't, know all the zoning in other communities, but things like places like Stanford, if you want to build a certain amount over a certain number of units, 10% or 20% have to be deed restrict or affordable. And they have a whole methodology to determine that. So they're increasing their supply of affordable housing every time they're getting market rates, not just if somebody takes one, one, not an overlay, Jen, but if they use the housing incentive option, it's just period. If they want to do multifamily in this area, they can do this, but they got to give us this. And I'd like to, put that in people's minds to, think about ways to incentivize. If we need to have the supply, but we need to have a supply that's equitable across the board.
Yeah, we're talking with Groton right now as part of their affordable housing plan about inclusionary zoning, which is that concept that you were just mentioning.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Sharon, Paul Rotello.
Yep.
During your presentation, you mentioned, I think HUD had 13 different categories for abandoned or vacant housing. And we're simultaneously talking about people on the low end and people on the high end who are either having to rent up or rent down. So that there's some, conflict in the market. And, what do we do about that? Do we incentivize people to modernize apartments? It's a great idea because we don't want them falling apart, but it doesn't increase the actual inventory. It just makes the apartments that are already existing more expensive. And that puts more pressure on the low end. On the other hand, if we incentivize developers to spend more money for luxury housing, we take care of the upper end immediately. But as with all luxury housing, the older it gets, the lower the premium. So that becomes a trickle down to the lower end. I don't know if you guys have thought about that, but it would seem to me that if you were creating public policy, obviously you have to do something if you have a lower end problem that's of an urgent nature. But if you're simply just planning for the future, it would seem to me after listening to this presentation that incentivizing upper end units would not be the worst thing in the world, because again, as they age, the premium drops. So you do two things. You wind up adding more affordable housing counterintuitively, even though you're building non-affordable housing, but you also simultaneously add more units. Whereas if you incentivize the modernization of existing units, you don't add any more units and you just make it more expensive for already struggling tenants. That seems to be my take on this. I think you need a little bit of both, but I think at the end of the day, you want to add more units, even if they're more expensive units, because ultimately they will become less expensive.
Yeah,
that's
and
just
I think
my take on that. And
I think, Paul, and that's, I would tend to agree. I would also say we don't have any land. I'm oversimplifying it, but there's not, what's left is very challenged, right? So is it infill, and is there kind of a mix of a little bit of, fix what's there?
I've lived in some of the larger cities in Connecticut. It always amazed me how they built purpose-built apartment buildings, which Danbury never really seemed to do. They were pretty comfortable in the 70s and 80s building multi-unit condominiums, but not really purpose-built apartment buildings, which are high-density housing in very small lots. Doing it now. Kennedy Place, BRT, things like that. But that's relatively new. And I think as cities grow and there becomes more and more pressure, and Denver's got 42, 43 square miles. We've got some space here. But I think you're going to see this. You're going to see a lot of pressure on some of these more open spaces being converted to higher density. It's just the way that cities seem to grow. If they're growing, and Danbury is, no idea how long that's going to keep going. But ultimately, I think you're going to see. I remember when the first multi-story office building was built in Danbury, we were just amazed at that. It was the one on Main Street, and thought the guys would go broke. And eventually, he had a very hard time finding tenants. But it's a going concern now. We were just like, wow, a multi-story office building. Danbury's one of those funny cities that when you look at it from the air, it doesn't really have a skyline because it's so friggin' big. It doesn't really need to concentrate stuff in one area. But we hit 75, 85, 95 100, 110, 120,000 people, I think we're going to start seeing projects like that. So, I mean, you know, I don't know if you want to call it overbuilding or interbuilding, but it would probably be something like that. We'd have to make that determination. Do we incentivize high density, multi-story? Dan Bertram's project that you remember on Kennedy Flats, the original project, not the one that was built, the 6 or 7 buildings, each one 10, 11 stories, something like that. I see, you know, in Danbury's future, and not that much of a distant future. Maybe that's an answer. I don't know.
Yeah, that was 540, 550, that plan. And they got 390, 375, I think, maybe. So.
Yeah, you know, the lot had challenges.
Yeah.
I think 10 years previous, no one would have even considered anything like that. And it didn't happen. I get that. But it's going to happen. And I think that's going to start absorbing a lot of these houses. You drive into the West Side, you look at some of those bridges. I would not have been able to conceive in the 1980s or 90s that kind of, that's like a Hamden style construction, right hard adjacent to New Haven. They're all pouring out of New Haven going into Hamden, and that's answering that need. Danbury doesn't have that issue. I mean, we're adjacent to, you know, North Salem and Brewster. We're adjacent to New Milford. We're not adjacent to a gigantic city that's pouring people in. We're generating this ourselves. So it's been really organic and slow, but I think it's picking up, you know. And I think people are going to have to get used to that concept. I think it's a foreign concept to a lot of people, having that kind of density in a city like Danbury. You know, it's going to be a tough sell, but it's like anything else. The old geezers like me, we're looking at it like completely askance, but the young guys, it makes perfect sense. So maybe that's what's going to happen.
The slides, I mean, it was a lot of information, but do we need to distinguish the rental versus purchase, and at which end? It appeared that a couple of the slides indicated that the economy would attract income that was higher with both rental as well as purchased units. Do we need to distinguish that on this list? That yes, there has to be more rentals as well as a unit that you would purchase.
I mean, I think these are all things that, you know, we'll look at when we get down to how do we get to kind of where we want to be. And from
trying to understand that wealth of slides we just went through.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of info.
Definitely. You know, I remember seeing one that, you know, kind of jumped out on me that really made it sound like a healthy Danbury would need more of both, which it was interesting and a new concept to me. So that's why I'm kind of throwing it out there. Am I interpreting it properly that we really do need both rental and home sales to have a healthy economy?
Yeah, I mean, from the data that we gathered together, I think there's certainly demand that could support both renter and owner households in the future. Absolutely. I mean, prices.
And by doing that and doing it properly, we could raise the mean income of those families that occupied those structures.
Well, we wouldn't be raising their income per se.
It appeared that was tied to that slide. That's why I brought it up.
No, I mean, if I were to make a recommendation, I think a mix of renter and owner occupied housing units in the future would be a good thing. And then I think a mix of price points, as we were just discussing, both on the owner and the renter side, would also be a positive thing.
Eric, what about like the single, I mean, owner occupied obviously takes a lot of forms, but just the single family owner occupied?
Yeah, I mean, the prices are going up and vacancy seems very healthy in Danbury, at least from the indicators that we've seen. I haven't talked to any brokers per se. That's usually the best way to find out what's going on. They usually have a good pulse on the market, but from the data that we've collected, it seems like there could certainly be demand for, for single family, certainly. It seems like the larger homes seem to make up a larger percentage of the sales over the last 5 years, like your 3+ bedroom houses. I think we're about 70% of all sales. And that seems to correlate with what we were finding on the household size, like that sort of, was something I wanted to follow up with, and I can wait until everyone sort of had a chance to weigh in on this question, but that was something that Summer and I found really interesting, is the growth in the 5+ person households. And we weren't sure if that was related to sort of one specific thing or a multitude of things. You know, some of the things that we were thinking about was like, what impact does the student population have, and are they rooming together more often and creating larger quote unquote non-family households? That was one thing. Another thing we pulled, I didn't present it today just because we had so much, but it will be in the report. Summer and I pulled a thing called subfamilies, which effectively is like multi-generational households. Or a subfamily could be, say, I move out of my parents' house and I start my own family. I get separated from my spouse, but I have a kid. Myself and my child come back and we live with my parents. Like, that's a subfamily effectively. And that is on the rise in Danbury and has been. So I didn't know if that was something that you all are seeing, just different types of household compositions that are not 2 parents and 3 kids, you know, for example, just something that's different than kind of your nuclear family.
Yeah, I would hazard to guess to say that the differences in our the cultures of our community give rise to, you know, families living together. They could be their cousins and they're sharing a house, and you know, they come from another country, and I think we've had a lot of I think that's what's going on in a lot of places, and particularly in downtown.
Yeah.
Because 5+ families is right. It's not, that hasn't been the norm in a very long time. So right, where's what's driving that? And I think it's, you know, we have a lot of good things to offer. So you know, it's a good place to live, and you know, work, you can get around, and there's public transportation, you're right on 84. And so, you know, families are coming, and there's, you know, whether they're coming from adjacent states or from other countries, and their relatives are coming, and they're all living together in a house.
Yeah, and I guess just sort of bring that all around again to housing, and sort of the question that Francisco's posed here with the type of housing. It also made me think, like, if you are a multi-generational household, do you want or need a certain type of housing unit? Like, I think back to, like, I think about Boston, for example, and the triple decker. Like, that used to be the classic multi-generational housing structure where, you know, somebody owned it, the owner might have lived on the first floor, then they rented it to their kids or their cousins or whoever as you go up the triple decker. You know, I mean, that's just one example. There's a lot of different forms that can take, but I wondered if, other than a large single family home, you know, do residents want different types of housing, or do they need different types of housing to sort of accommodate their household composition, what works for them?
Yeah, I would also say, and Jen can chime in, I mean, we haven't seen a subdivision in Danbury in 8 years, probably. I mean, a lot split here or there, but right, Jen? I mean.
That's right. The last one was Pondview Estates, and that wasn't a very big subdivision.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, there aren't big houses in the last, whatever years, 8 years.
And Sharon, why, let's follow up on that. Why is that? Is that because you're just running out of that land that's really easy to subdivide and build on, or is there just not the same market for that right now?
I think there wasn't a market for it. Now I think it might have changed a little bit. And you know, once you get into that and you have to build a road to city standards and utilities, it's costly. And then the flip side of that is, I was going to say, to encourage kind of the cluster development is really even a single family detached cluster, which we have some that have been approved and haven't been built yet, up like where the Amber Room is. I mean, those are smaller houses. I mean, they may be 3 bedrooms. I don't know if they're 4 bedrooms, but they're they're on little lots, clustered together, obviously, you know, and keeping some of the land as open space for a variety of reasons, whether it's wet or just, you know, it's too steep. But these big homes, I just don't, I mean, we've gotten a couple of them since I would say the pandemic, and that lots in old up on Peterson Farm that, you know, people came back around to look at and now are, you know, that sat fallow for many years, you know, that people are developing. So I agree. I mean, I think there is a market for those big homes. It's just, we don't have the physical space for that much. Unless, as
Sharon?
Paul said, you're going to go into an IL-40 land, you know, other
Well,
lands that would need to be rezoned.
I mean,
And
yeah,
then we
that's
have
what's gonna happen.
and the utility side of things, right? Where are we going to extend water and sewer and things like that?
If I may, one thing I did not notice, I was wondering if RKP's take on this was there was no mention of rooming houses. Is that the third rail in housing now, or does that still fulfill a need someplace? Because it would seem to me with an influx of, with a growing population of singles, rooming houses can fulfill some sort of a need there, and they can certainly pull in, if 30% of your 50% of your housing stock has 1 and 2 person households, 30% has 1 person households. It's possible rooming houses could fulfill a need. I don't know where the city is on that. I don't think the city even has any legal ones unless they've been grandfathered in.
Well, we have some, but the owner, I think, I don't have my zoning regs with me. They have to, I think the owner has to live there, if I'm not mistaken.
I had one and I converted it to a 3-family. It was a gold mine, but it was also a nightmare. But I mean, by converting it to a 3-family, there were probably 14 people in that house, and now there's 4 people. There was a lot of people wound up not living in that building that could be living there now. But there is some strain on neighborhoods when you have them. That's for sure.
Correct. That is very correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Bridget, what's the take on kind of the workforce housing? I mean, I think, again, the areas around downtown where the family, you know, the hatting factories were the workforce housing in the old days.
So I think this conversation has been really fun for me to be a witness to. So we're having the conversation they had about 100 years ago. It's almost the exact same conversation. We're talking about creating more population density and housing in the downtown corridor because we're running out of room because everything is farming in the outer parts of the town. So it's a lot of fun repeats of some of the conversation that we had when we went through massive growth about 100 years ago. So yes, I can absolutely see us going up instead of out. You know, I have the same land concerns that you mentioned earlier, that there's not a lot of land, and I'd hate to see a lot of our open space or any of that land that's privately owned and not city owned broken up to be developed or subdivided. That really changes the aesthetic of, and it changes the use, and it impacts, as we've talked about in multiple other meetings, impacts our schools, impacts every piece of our city. So, you know, where can we effectively and affordably provide these units of housing in a way that doesn't negatively impact the aesthetic and our current land use? It's downtown, and it's always been downtown. It's downtown where we have city services and city sewer. You know, it might have been mandated by the state to create city sewer in the late 1800s, but still we have it, and it's great. And we can easily use the infrastructure that already exists to create affordable housing, to create a little bit more of expensive housing, depending on what kind of units we're, you know, encouraging, and put them all downtown. And that comes back to the whole theory of creating a walkable downtown and creating a commercial zone downtown that is economically impactful, that development that is providing us with destination development, destination housing, and mixing it all together. And so you've already been laying the groundwork for this. Adding those several hundred units and redeveloping some of maybe where hatting factories were in the Main Street and extended corridor, as well as some of the housing. All of the the housing that's all there, that's all that some of it, which is very historic and is important to the aesthetic of the town, can be rehabilitated in a way that goes up and provides more units, in my opinion. And it'd be really interesting to see that happen. What I don't feel comfortable with, and which I think that we can probably discuss at greater length, is encouraging more subdivision in what would have been the town sections of Danbury, because we don't have that infrastructure ready-made and ready to go. And it might not give us the affordable housing that I think we're going to need. And one of the questions I had for you guys is that the figure that you gave us for Danbury's potential growth over the next several decades, is that a conservative estimate? Or is that is that an inflative estimate? I was looking at it as more of a conservative estimate based on the information that you presented at meetings past. And if that's a conservative estimate, then we need to be projecting out even more housing, just so that we stay comfortable within Danbury's growth pattern. And I know I've said this before, since 1684, Danbury has not gotten smaller. So, this constant renewal and constant growth isn't something that does appear that it's going to slow down and might actually pick up a little bit more. So is it a conservative number? Kind of curious.
I didn't know. I'm happy to answer the question about the number, but I didn't see past meetings and presentations. So if Francisco has anything to add, please do. But
yeah, no, go ahead, Eric. I think we in the past had presented Connecticut's population projection numbers, which are, those projections are several years old now, but they're likely fairly accurate for Danbury, and I do think for Danbury they were very conservative. But Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we use the CT Data Center's projections, which are a few years old.
Yep.
So I assume Francisco will use the same ones that you had presented, which is, it shows of just shy of like 5,000 people over the next 10 years. Which if we looked at, which if we look at sort of how it's been growing in 10-year increments, it's about the same, roughly. So I think it's kind of trends extended. So the one interesting thing I would say about the projections, Summer and I had a lot of back and forth about this over the last couple of weeks, is unlike many places where we work, Danbury's average household size, so if you took all the housing units, all the population, divided them by each other, that number has been going up. I think even since back to like 2000. It was, I think in 2010, Summer can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was around like 2.79 persons per household. And then I think now it's about 2.9. So it's gone up by about 0.12 persons per household over the last 9 years. If we were to, so the way we did our projections is we just pretended that we would use 2.9 and extrapolate that forward over the next 10 years and just use that as our average persons per household. But if we said over the next 10 years, it's going to go up again by another 0.12, that means you need fewer units to support more people because your household size continues to grow, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So to be honest with you, it kind of depends on what happens with that number. Like I said, in most places, that number is going down or remaining relatively consistent. In Danbury, that average number is going up. So if it keeps going up, you could probably support even more people with the same amount of housing units than you could if you just assumed that average household persons per household number stayed the same at 2.9. So.
Okay.
So I think 5,000 could potentially be conservative, as Francisco said.
Yeah, and I just have to say, I mean, having been on the other side of the, not being in government, I mean, building a 4-bedroom apartment is, nobody does it. Not nobody, but I mean, they're very rare. I mean, 3 is about your limit. So, and going up is kind of not a new concept because of Kennedy, but going up even higher than that, I think is kind of would be a real new concept. just for this community, not obviously everywhere else. I mean, it's commonplace, but I agree. I think we have to go up because we have to preserve the sensitive areas that are left on the outskirts. And whether that's kind of the swath along 80, along the 84 corridor, and, preserving things to the north and the south, because that's the transportation corridor and where utilities exist. That to me, I think is, at this point, where we should look. If we're going to increase density, that's the area we should look at, because we're sure as heck not going to do it down in on the Reading border, which makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
I'm just saying for all of us who know the area on the phone, on the call. So
What happens if we hit, you had mentioned, RKG had mentioned that we were going to need 445 additional rental units by 2030, and we'll probably hit that number in 2 years. I mean, between the News Times project and the Summit project could hit it if we didn't build a school there. They did it in a couple of years anyway. But even down to 200 with Dan's, what's Dan, 130 or something? I mean, that's 330 right there. What happens if we hit that number by 2023? Well, where do we go at that point? Do we just say, okay, we don't need to build anything else, or what? What happens then? One thing also that I've noticed, like if you look at apple blossom in some of these areas up by Briar Ridge on the west side, is they drew heavily from New York State. I don't think a lot of those people were planning on coming to Connecticut until those units were built. I think it's the same thing with the Reserve. I don't think we anticipated that there'd be a gigantic influx of New Yorkers looking for $900,000 condominiums. But when they were built, they came in. And I think that's the same thing with these projections. If we build this stuff, they'll come in and fill them up. And then we just have to keep building them. I think it's relatively endless. Not that that's a bad thing. I'd much rather be in a growing community than a shrinking one. But some of these projections, I mean, 444 units in 9 years, we're going to do that in 19 months probably. Then what happens,
So I'll say again that those projections are just based on the population projections, and also sort of in and out migration that's happening in the community just naturally. So as units are vacated by people who move to a different unit within Danbury, move outside of Danbury, pass on, whatever it might be. So that is factored in there, in addition to the demand from the new incoming residents. But I think projections are tricky because a lot can happen. For example, no one predicted the pandemic and the impact that would have on the housing market, not just pricing, but also geographic mobility. We're working in a couple of communities in Connecticut, and I've heard from several developers and brokers that the outmigration from New York City created a market that wasn't even there prior to the pandemic. So it's super interesting. So it's hard to predict those things. And then I think, like I said, if that household number, the average persons per household number happens to come down a little bit, or for some reason there's an influx of single person households or more two-person households than what we've sort of projected going forward, then that just means there's going to be additional demand for units. And at that point, it's really a city decision as to whether or not you want to keep growing, or you want to try to cap growth, using your regulatory powers, or not extending infrastructure to certain parts of the community where you could potentially have more housing or more jobs or commercial or industrial development. I mean, it's not just about housing, of course. I think that's the beauty, and hopefully Francisco would agree with me, the beauty of doing a POCD is sort of trying to look at all these things holistically, look at the community and try to figure out, okay, what do we want to encourage, where, at what time period do we want to do it, and then how do we do it, or how do we encourage it, or how do we limit what we want to do. By no means is the 450 units of rental housing a cap. It's just kind of an estimate based on those projections, which I think we talked about are a little bit outdated at this point.
Okay, and then Any other questions or comments regarding Eric's work before we move on to the other agenda items?
Thank you, Eric. And Summer, that was a lot of great information.
All right, let's move on to the map. Next slide. So as I mentioned, Sharon and I have been passing back and forth our neighborhood map. Within the plan, we want to be able to point to areas. And let's use housing as an example. When we talk about areas that are maybe suitable for more housing, and where in the city. So we want to be able to point to these areas and have policies that are specific to areas. And that's the purpose behind coming up with a map that carves up Danbury into some discrete pieces. And this is not quite a land use map. A land use map would be a lot more granular than this. And it's not quite a zoning map either, although it does line up with a lot of your development zones. This is likely going to be the foundation for your future land use map. And as a reminder, the future land use map is a required and very important component of the POCD. And that lays the foundation for any zoning changes that you make. They are required to be consistent with that future land use map, or you need to update your future land use map as you're rezoning. So it's important to know what you have, and we see this as being the foundation for it. And once again, feel free to, once we share the presentation, the PDF, feel free to review it. But we think we're kind of honing in on something that is fairly representative of the really different areas that you have in the downtown in Danbury. And what you can see is that most of that radiates from the downtown. Downtown being in the red, with the older, more historic, denser central residential district in lighter green around it. And then you have the various campuses, whether associated with the hospital, Western Connecticut, or FCI Danbury. And then your commercial areas, Eastern Commercial, Central, Western, and yellow. And to the west, the PND area, which correct me if I'm wrong, Sharon, but that stands for Planned Neighborhood Development, right? That zone.
Yes.
And then of course, surrounded on the periphery by relatively low density, and in some cases very low density, such as in the southern residential area, low density residential, single family, medium to large lot. So that's where we're at, and this will be our template moving forward that we could use to reference areas of the city.
Yeah. No comments on my chicken scratch map on the left.
Yeah, well,
No, I'm just kidding.
There is a lot of work that goes into this. We were, on our end, we were working in GIS, doing some technical work, and on Sharon's end, she got the colored pencils out. And that's what it takes.
Dating myself, but that's how best we do it. Just go back to old school and tracing paper and different colors. But and again, don't get, we could label them anything, because we know the areas that we were just trying to get kind of the neighborhoods kind of pinned down a little bit, and we could change what we call them along the way.
All right. Next slide. Our stakeholder list. It is growing thanks to Jennifer and Sharon, who've been populating this. And Sharon, do we want to, when we share the presentation, do we want to have people, if they know of any names, do we want to have them kind of fill in the blanks for us here?
Sure.
If they have any contacts, just get back to us with.
Yeah, they can email. Yeah, you can email me or Jen, or and we'll just fill it in. Again, we took our initial list and our discussion from the last meeting, and then I just I sorted it in alphabetical order. So that's all.
And this is just the first page. On the next slide, we have this is a pretty long list. Go ahead, Eric. Next. Thank you. So yeah, we've got a nice list, and we don't expect that all of the organizations or individuals on this list are going to fully get engaged in the process, but we need to start with a real casting a wide net and find the people that are really interested in participating in the process. Okay, next slide. The website. I did get a report on website traffic, and I didn't put the number on here because it's a small number. And that's really because even though we've gotten some press attention in our work, we have yet to really engage the public. So they're not scrambling to find out what it is we're doing to make sure we're not doing something wrong, which drives a lot of people, or scrambling to find the meeting or whatever they heard about. So once we start promoting, and that promoting is going to, any survey and any sort of events that we conduct, it's going to come in the form of email blasts to all these different groups and organizations and a press release. We'll start driving traffic to the site. But as a reminder, we have all of our presentations, agendas, meeting minutes up on the site, currently available. We update it right away. And so it can be a useful tool for you to pull down a presentation if you wanted to go back and review it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And next slide, our schedule. So here we are, I don't know, a quarter of the way or so into the process, quarter to a third of the way into the process. And we've got another couple of months, another 3 months worth of discovery phase, this coming to you with what we found before we really need to start pivoting to what are the ideas? What do we need to do? What needs to happen? What are the priorities, the goals, the policies, et cetera? And so at some point, our meetings are going to pivot to more working sessions where we'll seed those conversations with, this is what we think you should consider. What do you think? Do you have any other ideas? That's that sort of meeting. It'll be a little less PowerPoint charts and graphs and maps. But throughout the summer, we'll continue in this kind of format. All right, and next slide, our very next steps are our next meeting. We're going to bring it all back to land use and zoning. So we'll really dig into that map and take a look at exactly how your land is used and how the zoning, your zoning lines up with that. And that'll afford us an opportunity to see maybe to talk about whether or not your zoning is supportive of more housing development, by example, or more economic development, and how it lines up with the geography and where you might have vacant land or underdeveloped land, that sort of thing. And of course, all along the way, we're continuing to compile all of this information and building a library of maps to work from. And finally, the next slide is a reminder. Our next meeting is in June. It's on the 15th next month. And we will, we'll, in addition to land use and zoning, we're going to be a month further along into understanding how we can roll out our public engagement schedule. And I think we'll likely have Marcy Miller from my office on that meeting. She's going to be running the public engagement for us. Okay, any closing questions or comments?
Anybody?
Paul?
Yeah, I have one. It occurs to me that the discussion needs to begin with what kind of a future Danbury sees for itself. Martha's Vineyard, 100 square miles, 5 towns with completely different populations, has a constant fight between affordability, high density, and open space, which means Nantucket, McMansions, things like that. Does Danbury, which has some influence on its growth, want to grow? We don't have to. We could sort of freeze where we are now. Prices would continue to go up. People would be priced out of Danbury. They'd have to commute from New Milford, from Southeast, whatever, to service a locked-in Danbury population. That's a model. I mean, and that's a conversation I think the city needs to have. Or we open the gates up to some sort of responsible development, maybe some high densities. Go back to what Bridget had talked about and what I talked about too. And I think once we come to that determination, and I don't know what that's going to be, then we could figure out how to make that happen. Is this going to be part of RKG's process going forward, or did I miss that in the first couple of meetings,
Yeah.
which I was not able to attend?
Well, that's part of our process as a team, as a whole, and as this committee. One of the first things that we'll do when we're done just kind of gathering information and telling you what things look like is we're going to conduct a visioning session. And that's where we just have a conversation about who you are, what your priorities are, what you want for your future. And we'll have an hour and a half long conversation about that, a very open discussion. And we really want to get everyone to participate. And we'll be doing the same thing with the public as well.
Right.
Very similar. And from that, we're going to just start bullet point all these items, and then we're going to craft that into a vision statement. And that is the overarching framework within we're going to work for the rest of the plan. All the ideas that come out through the plan about what we should do and what's important, we're going to check against that vision statement to see if it comports with it, if it's supported by that vision statement. And if it's
Sounds
not,
great.
I'll do it.
That's great, thanks. I'm firmly in the camp of responsible growth. I'm comfortable with it, but I recognize not everybody is. So that's obviously a discussion the entire city needs to have. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Eric, do you want to make me host again, and then I can just shut everything down when we're done? Great. Well, we will share, as usual, we will share the PowerPoint. If you have any comments on the maps, names of anybody else or organizations, please email myself or Jen, and we'll just keep adding to the list. I know we didn't have a whole crew today, although let me see what we have now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think we're one shy, right, Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll record this as like a meeting with meeting notes, and hopefully we'll get back at the next meeting with enough people to approve the official meeting minutes from April, and we'll post these as meeting notes. And if anybody has any other comments, questions, anything, feel free. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Eric and Summer. Just great data. We're for us data geeks and people analyzing. And remember, too, the 2020 census is coming. And they're going to trickle out that information over I think the next several months. And that's going to be interesting to see kind of how that plays out as well. And as Francisco said, they'll be doing some adjustments along the way, because our plan won't be ready until 2022 anyway. So, okay, with that, thank you, everybody. Unless anybody has any comments, we'll see you next month.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you, Sharon.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
thank you so
everyone.